sister, his parents had died, and his sister raised him, let her know that he had fallen in. So he just went near the barrel and dried. His clothes got dried right there. But Linda talked about the American store, and that was at the corner of Main and DeVoe. And that was the big store. And then we had a butcher shop. You didn't have to leave town in those days to get your groceries or get your meat. You had Dept's store that was located near where the firehouse is located, where the post office is located. You would be able to buy all your delicious meats there, or Shapiro's. And that was before Zagna took over. He was just a young boy then. And his parents, and maybe you remember Shapiro's grocery store. And years later, when the parents died and the sons took over, and then the one son and his wife Lillian had the ice cream store on the side, if you remember getting your ice cream there.
Al's, I think it was called Al's.
It was called Al's, right? Mm-hmm. And it was delicious. And then we had, when I was a kid, past the American store, there was a little hardware store there, and there was also an ice cream parlor. And that ice cream parlor was run by a Mr. Johnson. And we and Mr. Johnson always had penny candies, and a penny in those days was worth an awful lot. And after school we'd go over there, and he was so patient with us. We'd look and everything was covered, and he had to grab it from his side. In those days you didn't have anything that was out. You had to ask for everything. And he was so patient with us. We'd say, oh, we want this, and maybe we had 2 pennies and we'd want that. And he always wore a wig. And one day when we were at the lake and we were fishing, we were watching the men fishing, and he was fishing there, and he had his fishing pole, and when he threw it back, the wig came off. So after that, he had the nickname of Wiggy. And was it Bess who worked in there with him? No, it was Mrs. Dinkle. Mrs. Dinkle worked in there with him, and she was very patient, and he had the best ice cream.
My mother mentions that in her diary too, that every day when she walked down to the post office in Spotswood to get the mail, she would see different people along the way, and there was this one gentleman in particular that stopped at that ice cream parlor where they sold Dolly Madison ice cream.
Yes.
And this one gentleman would walk his little dog in and buy a dish of ice cream for his dog every day.
Oh, that was interesting. I didn't know that. But when you went to the American store, nothing was out. Everything was on shelves, although we did have big barrels of things. And he would scoop it out then. And but nothing like today. When you go to the store, everything is out. In those days, you had to ask, oh, Mr. Smith, I want this, and he would get it for you. Even I remember they had, in those days, people couldn't afford butter all the time, so he had the great big thing. It looked like lard. It was white in the back, and he would scoop that out and put it in a container, and then you would get coloring to color it too, so it would be like butter. And
that sounds like during the war when we had the oleomargarine. Remember
it was like that too, yes, with the right. And then I remembered when I was a kid, we did have the drugstore in town, and the drugstore was where at the time, if you remember, Burgess Hotel. But before that, it was Valit's Hotel. Right. And right on the corner was the druggist, but it didn't remain in town too long. I guess he didn't get enough business. But if you wanted to go into the city, all of my family, the relatives, lived in New York City. There was a train. We had a nice train station, a train that left every morning, and it would go directly into Penn Station. Years later, while they still had that train, you had to change at South Amboy and then get the train into New York. But for years, we had that train and the station. And coming back from New York, it would come in it would leave New York at 5 o'clock. And my dad worked in New York, and he would come back on the train, and it was always great when I was a kid to see what he had in his pockets for his chocolate or little treats that we always enjoyed. And I remembered my father did have a car then, and it was, I had a sister and a brother, and it had a rumble seat in the back, but also in the back there was like a shelf, and my sister and I would sit on that. And going into New York City, we used to take the ferry going over there.
Speaking of the railroad, my grandfather, Merritt Brown, worked for the railroad. I think he was a conductor, but I'm not sure. But my mom said that he used to come home with punch boards. Do you know what punch boards are? They were some sort of a game that I guess you would punch holes in this board and there'd be a prize.
Yes, I do. Okay. That didn't have anything to do with it.
Oh, it didn't? I didn't know if it did or not.
No.
But the trains, that was unusual too. When I worked in the post office, I worked here in the post office after high school with Jack Lark and then Mrs. Geipel. Remember?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we had Donald Severs used to come and pick up our mail because it used to go out by train, and they used to have a little hook up by. Do you remember that?
Yes.
At the train station.
Yes.
And he used to have to put up the registered mail on this hook, and the train would come past, and they'd grab that. That's how we got our mail out.
That's right. I remembered seeing that.
Yes.
Sometimes we just enjoyed seeing the trains go by.
And that was before we had our mail carriers. This is a little bit early, I guess.
Yes, that was way before that. But when we always had to go into town. I lived on Landale Road, and Linda mentioned the Donkey Bridge. Yeah. And the Donkey Bridge was a shortcut that we would take, those of us who lived in the Brookwood section. It would be really a shortcut going into town. We would have little bridges to go over, and then this great big bridge, the Donkey Bridge. And if we walked all around through Monday Avenue and DeVoe, and it would take us quite a while getting into town. So none of us wanted to walk that way. But sometimes it would get flooded. And I remembered, my parents, I guess, never realized this. We kids would still go across. The Donkey Bridge was half broken. And I remembered Andy Paprota went across it, and I figured Andy was a great big guy. And I said, well, if Andy can go across, so can we. And the bridge was very wobbly, and we got across, and after we got across, it washed away.
Yeah.
But we would still try and go through that way.
Yeah, they used that for years and years, that bridge. That was a good one.
The Donkey Bridge ended on George Street, and one day a car thought he could go because George Street was a dead-end street. But this car didn't know it, and he came, and I'm coming over the bridge, and I see this car coming, and I put my hands up, and no, don't come. This is only pedestrians, because I figured if that car ever went over it, it would really be down in the water, because that bridge would never hold it. It wasn't that strong.
Lillian, I remember the bridge in the 50s and early 60s. When was the bridge first built? Do you remember? The Donkey Bridge?
I was very young.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's the way I walked to school. We always walked that way. Dates I don't remember, but it was there a long, long time. Today, it isn't. I don't think it's there anymore today, because the area where we used to, Brookside Road or Woodland Road, there were all houses built on there now. So, and it was a big hill there, and I never thought they'd ever built houses there. But as a kid, we took advantages of the brook. There was a brook that ran at the end of Landvale Road and down through the back. And we would go swimming there, and many, many a day we would bring, as entertainment for kids, we would bring potatoes, and the guys would build a fire and put in the potatoes in the sand, and when it was over, we would eat it, and it was wonderful. It was great, and think nothing of it. And then Linda mentioned the Legion Hall, going there with a group. When I was a kid, the Legion Hall used to show us movies. We didn't have a movie theater here. The closest place was South River or Jamesburg, and you would have to take a bus. But in those days, we had good bus service. If you wanted to go to Lakewood, if you wanted to go to New York, there was the bus. It was great. And you have anything to add on?
American Legion? Oh, the American Legion was a lot of fun when I was growing up as a teenager, too, because there were always dances there. And as a teenager growing up in the 50s, early 60s, we would have dances at Immaculate Conception that the CYO would run for us. And we'd have dances at all the different halls in Spotswood. It always seemed to be something going on as far as a teenage activity, whether there was some monkey business going on too, but that was all right. We had a lot of good fun and kept busy. And I think dances are something that you don't hear much of anymore. You know, maybe the schools have a prom or occasional dance, but it was very prevalent in Spotswood growing up in the 60s that you had that kind of entertainment to look forward to. I also wanted to mention Christie's, Mr. Christie's store.
Yeah.
Christie's is a store that is now Ellie's Deli, and it's on Manalapan Road and at the foot of John Street. And Mr. Christie's store, I don't know how long it was there for many years. Because when my grandparents lived in the house that I now live in, they used to frequent that store, and that's the time when you could go to a store and buy food, and they'd just give it to you and write a little receipt for you, and you paid when you had the money.
One business we wanted to know more about, there was a bakery at the end of John Street.
Yes, I remember the baker shop there. It was around the corner, it burned down.
Oh, yeah, I never knew there was a bakery there.
You know where the empty lot is? Next to, in back of Adrian's house.
Right there.
At John and Manalapan.
Oh.
It was a great baker shop. I remembered as a kid going there and enjoying it. When I would visit Adrian Boyce, who lived on John Street.
And still does.
And still lives there.
Yeah, and the Methodist Church, the original Methodist Church, was built along there also.
Oh,
and
that's right.
The third house that's there is used to be the Methodist Church.
Yeah, my grandmother and my mother.
Reverend Kalkenauer.
Reverend Kalkenauer, right?
Yes.
My mother and her mother were members of the Methodist Church, which I guess my mother was a young woman, and she grew up in the church, and she also sang in the choir. And that was a big...
Jenny, my sister-in-law,
Aunt Jenny. I was really privileged to grow up as I did because on my block of John Street to New Street to River and Manalapan Road, there were 7 homes there that were owned by relatives of mine, aunts and uncles, cousins galore. And it was just, there was always some place to go within walking distance. And as a little child, you know, even being, 4 years old, I remember my mother letting me take my 3-wheel tricycle and ride my bike to any one of my aunt's houses.
Yes,
And it was
it's true.
it was a
good
safe
place to grow
time.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
In my day, we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have the type phones that we have today. When we finally got a phone, it was a phone that 5 other people, at least 5 other
Yes.
people were on it. And you answered, you had maybe your number would be 1 ring, maybe Nancy's would be 2, and Linda's would be 3 rings. So you knew if it just rang 1, and you had an operator. And when you got on the phone, the operator would say, "Whom do you wish to call?" And they would not, and they would get to know you after a while.
Yes.
It's not like today where you have the cell phones, you just dial, or you just dial and pick it up. That's come a long, long way.
We have a picture of the SERP's meat delivery wagon where his phone number is listed as 25. They didn't always have a lot of digits. Yeah.
Because each one, there were 5 different, so some of them had 5 rings, and you knew if there were 5 rings, and then when you picked up the phone, you wanted to make a call. Forget it, someone was on the phone, and you had to hang up and wait until they were finished, and you didn't dare listen to their conversation. You wanted to. But your mother and dad would say, "Hang up that phone." That's their private conversation. To get back to me, I taught for 40 years in Spotswood. I loved what I taught. The first year I taught 2nd grade. And then I went up to junior high. And I taught many different subjects, but ended up being a reading specialist. I enjoyed teaching speed reading. I also taught in the high school, and that was one of the courses that was offered to the students. And I always told the Board of Education, I had to go to school to learn how to do all of this. And I said, it's so wonderful to be able to teach these students how to do speed reading. I'd use tachistoscopes and other forms of machinery where I would flash up a number, and my students could read it just like this. And one of my students I saw the other day, and he was a state trooper, and he said, Mrs. Mortimer, remember that machine you used where you would flash up numbers and words? He says, they gave us that in the state trooper training. And I said, you're right. I know you're right, because they also do that in police training, where they flash up the words. And I remembered when we'd have open house, and my students started out slowly and then worked their way up. And I would invite one of them to come in, and during the time when the parents were there, and I would flash it real fast. The parents had no idea what was there, and the student wrote the number right down. And it was very gratifying, all the many years that I taught. I loved what I did. Today, no matter where I go, I meet students, and my family and my friends always say, boy, I can't, no matter where you go, there's someone who knows you. I remember once when I was in the UN upstairs in the dining room, and this lady came over and she said, "You're Mrs. Mortimer, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And it happened to be a parent of one of my students. But they were wonderful years for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with all the students. I taught so many students. I don't know how many I taught altogether, but when you think of 6 periods a day and changing midterm, and that's a lot of students.
Even today, you have 3 of your favorite students with us.
That's right. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Steve back there is also a student.
It was wonderful having Aunt Lily as a teacher. It was one of my favorite classes, and I really, your class really brought me along in my reading, I remember, because I just developed such a love for reading. And if we had to read 4 books for a marking period to do a book report, I would have read 30 by the end of the marking period, because you just instilled a lot of excitement.
Thank you.
Did Aunt Lily give you an A?
You know, I don't remember. In my mind, I like to think that I got all A's, but I know that's not true.
You were a good student and a great writer.
Well, Nancy mentioned before about the Red Men and some of these other old societies in Spotswood. Could you tell us a little about some of those?
No, I can't tell you a lot about the Red Men because I think they're a very private society, but I do have a book of the Red Men. And a couple of my relatives are mentioned in there, but I know people in Spotswood belong to them, yeah.
Well, what kind of things did they do?
Pardon?
What did they do?
It was a society. Actually, it started out, they were called the Red Men because when you had Paul Revere and the whole thing, the colonials, they dressed up as Indians to do all these horrible things that they weren't supposed to do against the people that were in charge here, and they were just like instigators, I guess, of trying to get the revolution going. So they were part of that kind of things. But the Red Men Society is only for good things that they're doing now. It went downhill because I think there was no place to meet, so they used to meet in taverns, and I think that was the problem of the downfall for a little while of the Red Men, but they've come back, and I think there's still a society over in New Brunswick.
But it still exists.
Yeah, I think it still does.
Did not know that.
I'm not too sure about all the things that I've said, but I think most of it is kind of true. The other thing, you mentioned SERPs when they had the delivery. We had a lot of delivery cars and trucks around. Remember, we used to have the fellows that used to come through and they used to sharpen our knives and everything. We had the fish. Remember that on Fridays we used to have the fishermen used to come through.
Oh, yes.
We had all kinds of different things. We used to have the ragmen. Do you
The
remember them?
ragman,
They used to come
he'd
and
ring a bell,
and
rags,
you'd have to get all your rags together.
A vegetable truck.
Weigh 'em. Yeah, they had vegetable truck. We had a lot of delivery men that came through. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Donald Severs that used to take the mail for us. His father used to deliver the ice.
That's right.
They used to have the ice, and before that we
Yes.
had somebody else did the ice. Mr.
I only remembered Mr.
I
Severs.
think Applegate.
It was?
I think it was one of the Applegates used to deliver the ice.
Yes, you're right.
And yeah, and then it was Charlie Severs did it for a while. He delivered the coal too. We used to have coal that
That's
came into the house. We used to burn coal. We used to have to shovel that in until they changed to oil, and we got a little more convenient in the house.
That's right. And in your cellar, you had
Yes,
to have
we
a
used to have
boarded
the
up place.
yes, there
And
was
when
a
they
chute.
delivered the coal, it went down the chute and would fill it up, and then you would have to shovel into your.
And the icemen,
furnace.
we needed the ice because we didn't have refrigerators. We used to
had-
have an ice chest, so they used to come in and put the ice in. And they used to cut it. My father used to tell me they used to cut the ice from the Spotswood Lake years ago. My family goes back to like, I don't know,
I heard that too.
1800s or something
Yes.
in town.
Yes.
If you go to the St. Peter's Episcopal Church, they have a Bible up there that has all the records of all the people. And in there, our family goes back, I don't know how far, 1790, I think. But we used to have to pay for our pew. They used to have a little thing there that if you wanted to have a pew, you would pay $25. I don't know if that was for the year or for the month, but I think probably for the year
I
back in
think for
those
the
days.
year.
Yeah, but you used to pay for that. A lot of things. There's a lot of history in our church cemetery and also in the book there. What else can we tell you about the delivery people? It's something else.
One thing that I didn't hear anyone mention was about the Spotswood Garden Club.
Oh, yes,
Oh,
they had that. Yes, my
Yeah,
mother
that-
belonged to that.
Okay,
Yes,
because
yes.
I guess that was in existence before my time. But being that my family, the Brown